left there, out-of-field teaching across teaching disciplines and contexts. So we did have a focus on context, and there's 4 different contexts that make up the parts of the book. The first one's looking at the political context and looking at the implications of that at different levels, both at the system, school and teacher level. Personal context, which relates to the ideas of support, identity, the experiences and beliefs, self-efficacy, those sort of things as well. And the professional learning context, looking at both on-the-job learning as well as professional learning. And then the teaching practice context, so what actually happens in the classroom interface, what the practices are, the knowledge is needed, and those sorts of things. So these are the different parts and the chapters, and I've kept the authors there so you can have a look. It's got representation across, I think, 6 different countries. I don't really want to go through all of them, but they're there for you to look at in your own time. You have the PowerPoint there. In terms of beginning the conversation around potentially modelling, putting together a model for future research, there's different ways of thinking about what to consider. The first is the context, so that's the middle point of that diagram, which forms the different parts of the book that I just went through. Then we've got this idea of the phenomenon, and we talked a little bit about that last time we met, actually, in Germany, and we did some big butcher's paper type diagrams and models, and also Raphaela's done some work. So Raphaela's going to talk about her framework for thinking around the phenomenon and what can be the focus on research. Then you've got the idea of the research approach, so what's actually research and how it's done, and then the outcomes. So that's going to be the structure for the way we talk today. In terms of context, we've got those contexts in the middle. You can think about it in terms of scale, so national, state, international, local, personal, those sort of things. And then you could talk about it in terms of the scope. So we're looking at primary, secondary, and the notion of teacher learning. So we've got lots of ways of thinking about out of field in primary settings, out of field in secondary, but also out of field as it pertains to teachers doing something new. Like Emily's work, for example, science teachers who are teaching new to the digital technologies within that space. So I think there's some interesting ways of thinking around what out of field teaching means as a context. Whoops, a daisy. And then, so then we will go on to the next slide, which is over to Raphaela to talk about the phenomenon aspects.
Yes, I try to figure out a way how to understand research and out of field teaching much better, but also in order to find a classification that allows to find gaps in research. And what I tried to implement here are 3 levels that some of you might be familiar with. It's the micro level, so we talk about people, individuals. Then there's the meso level. Is the institutional level. So in our terms, the university or the schools. And then we have the macro level, the system level. So mostly it's about the policy, the level. And then we, for each of the levels, we can look at the conditions, at the processes and the effects. And this is just an example. So when we look at the micro level, then we could, for example, for the conditions, we could look at teacher characteristics. For example, we can compare any characteristics of out-of-field teachers and compare them with in-field teachers. That's a way how it was done in order to identify if what is needed by other field teachers. Then we of course look in the middle and the processes part or cell. We look at the teaching practices and at the behavior, at the actions that teachers show. And finally, we could look at the effects. So on the student side, that was has been done in the past very often, and it still is, as we heard yesterday too. And we could also look at other outcomes or effects, for example, on this the teacher's health, etc. Yeah, and if you try to put, for example, our chapters into these all in all 9 cells, then there are some difficulties because, of course, some studies not only address one focus, one part, one cell, so to speak. So it could be, of course, that just take mine, for example, the Porsch and Wilden, our chapter. We could say we talk about conditions. Yeah, we actually looked at different at teachers with different qualifications, but we also actually looked at practices and processes. I put it here in the first cell on the left, down left, where it's because this is the major focus of this chapter. But still, it's not always like clear cut where to put it. But still, when you see here and the table filled with the names of the first authors, you see there are some gaps, and you also see that practices and processes are the main focus of the book, which is fine. Yeah, we did not say, you know, I mean, you didn't even have this classification, but you see that we might in future, when we talk about future research, that the political context, for example, should be addressed more often, that we should think about how can this be done. And also the educational level has not been addressed very often. Actually, my presentation will be about this educational, about this meso level, but this is just an idea, and we can now or later can talk about this classification.
Yeah, thanks, Raphaela. So in looking through the chapters and the key foci for the different chapters that we've got, and then looking at the research features and the outcomes that emerge, I think it's useful to look at what's actually coming out of research when you compile them all together. So across the papers, where there's some use of large data sets. We saw some of that yesterday. There's a critique of the system itself, which is really important. There's document analyses, there's use of critical theory. Interviews also are used within this space, and also the literature review, so understanding what's emerging already in the literature. And then we're looking at the research outcomes. There's a focus on relationships with teacher qualifications in terms of prevalence, student achievement, distribution, and then the amount of I guess the proportion of load, that workload, representation of the phenomenon across different systems as well. Definitions were coming up, not just in mine, but in others as well, and looking at those factors that actually influence that distribution and supply and demand. In terms of the personal context, it's a little bit different in that the focus shifts very much to the teacher's experience, how they negotiate the demands of teaching, and there's a number of factors there that are often the focus of research. Also, moving to the different contexts of out of field, pre-service or in-field, in-service, you've got graduate teachers and experienced teachers, in-field, out of field demands, primary, secondary, those sort of things, which is really interesting to look across the board. And then there's your classic data collection tools, interviews, questionnaires. a bit of reflection too on self and development, which is really interesting to look at. And also there's large data sets all the way down to autobiography and everything in between. In terms of outcomes, there's a questioning of what does and can out of field mean, obviously, once you start looking across those different contexts. An introduction of the notion of deprofessionalisation of the teaching profession. I think that's a really important area to move into. The school context and their supports, teachers as learners, as on-the-job type learners. There's a lot of typologies that emerge. There's strengths. I really like the focus on looking at the strength of the out-of-field people that they're bringing from their in-field, moving away from that deficit language. Subject specialists versus interdisciplinarity. That's a really interesting one that Fiona's brought up into the mix. Really interesting. And then subject-specific differences in terms of knowledge and pedagogy. When looking at teaching practice, the focus then shifts to teacher factors of practice. So your teacher moves pedagogy, the knowledge, beliefs, orientation to being on the job, etc. Again, comparisons between different groups of out-of-fieldness and in-fieldness, etc. And levels, PST and in-service. Also, there's judgments made, and I don't mean that in a negative term. I mean that there's judgments in terms of self-reports and compared to objective observation and then exams. So these are different ways that judgments are being made. Longitudinal to single point in time data collection. Good to have that variety, and also the different contexts of primary and secondary. Different research outcomes, typologies are a big one. What it means to negotiate the boundaries within that teaching space. Again, effects of being out of field on knowledge and identity in terms of practice, and tools emerging there in terms of a nice profiling tool and ways to support teachers, and that included a number of tools there. And then there's the professional learning space, looking at how teachers change over time, often before and after an intervention, different points of your career entry, and different ways of entering the career, the lateral entrance or alternative pathways, which is a more more common to generic term, lateral entrance and career changes and all that language. Again, some similar sort of data collection tools. That idea of self-assessment comes under question a little bit in some of those articles. And then in terms of research outcomes, they're looking for that teacher change. As I said, the notion of transition is an interesting one, out of field to in field, pre-service to in-service, but also a work content, a non-school and school type contexts as well, those sort of transitions. There is implications raised for professional development and postgrad quals. Again, deprofessionalisation emerged, and look at those wonderful tools. You got 4 tools there. Productive pedagogies, that was from Susan's. Yeah, the structured lesson. No, that was Sam in Israel. Your core, which we heard about yesterday from Jared. Subject standards, which is Susan's, and also that reflexivity tool, also from Susan's, which is looking at reflection. So a few different tools there. So looking across the potential outcomes that are emerging then for here, and I think this probably speaks to what we're talking about here. You've got your typologies and categories of things. You've got your degrees of impact or distribution or workload, so how much. You've got your judgments of fit and quality, and again, I don't mean judging, but it's determination of fit in terms of those things. You've got your descriptions of experience and theorization using that. Effects of interventions, you've got your tools, and you've got critique of policies and practices, and you can see those summarised up there in that little image. There are a number of recommendations. The orange ones are for practice. The green ones are for training, so initial teacher education, and then you've got the blue ones, which are policy. Some of them cut across a number of them with the little multicolors. So it's really interesting to look at. Sorry, I was finishing up the key up there. So green is for the teacher education, and the orange is for teaching practice. A professional development, I suppose you could lump that one into the green one too. In terms of future directions, there's a number listed here, but there can be summarised in these future direction arrow at the top. You can be looking at cumulative effects. You can be looking at the ethics associated with it, more from that critical angle. Change over time and enduring effects of being out of field, but also of interventions, I think is really important. The cultural effects of expectations, cultural effects, yeah. So what the predominant culture expects and how that impacts on out of field and how teachers engage with professional development. And then I think we need to start much more delineation of subject specific differences. What's different about being out of field in different subjects? So to my mind, some of these things came from things that I think are important and that are so far not really dealt with in the literature. So we can bring all that together in this very messy diagram. You've got your phenomenon there, you've got your outcomes, you've got your various elements of research around those different contexts and your future research. So look, that's a very whirlwind sort of look at what's in the book, but also maybe there's some elements of that that you think might be of interest to you for your research. So at that point, I'd like to open it up to everybody and to talk about, which elements of that you found resonated with you particularly. Maybe that's a good question to start with.